All right, energy. Let's talk about it. I mean, have you ever actually thought about what life would be like without energy? No lights, no internet, forget about binging our favorite shows. It's kind of crazy how essential energy is to, well, pretty much everything we do. And yet we almost never actually stop and think, where does it all come from? Today, we're going to take a deep dive into Europe's energy mix. It's like this giant recipe, and it's undergoing a pretty massive transformation right now, shifting away from the traditional fossil fuels and moving more and more towards renewable sources.
It's a really fascinating shift, and it has huge implications not just for Europe, but for the entire world, honestly.
Absolutely. We've got two fantastic resources that we're using to guide our deep dive today. So first up, we have Eurostat's interactive report. It's called Shedding Light on Energy in Europe 2025 edition, and it is absolutely packed with data and insights.
Yes, it's a great resource.
It is. And then to get a more business-focused perspective, we're also taking a look at Renewable Revolution. It's an episode from the Haptic R&D Consulting podcast.
So we're basically bringing together the hard data with that expert analysis, all to help you understand what's happening in Europe's energy landscape and what it all means for the future.
Exactly. Okay, so you mentioned energy mix just a minute ago. Can you break that down a little bit for anyone who might not be familiar with that term?
Yeah, for sure. Think of it like a recipe, right? Just like you'd use a bunch of different ingredients when you're making a dish, an energy mix combines different sources to meet a region's energy needs. So it basically tells us where is a country, or a region in this case, getting its energy from.
That's interesting. So what does Europe's energy mix actually look like right now in 2025?
Well, the 2023 data from Eurostat reveals a kind of surprising fact. The EU actually only produced about 42% of its own energy needs. So that means that they had to import more than half of their energy.
Wow, more than half. That seems, I don't know, kind of precarious, especially with everything that's been happening geopolitically these days. What does that even say about Europe's energy security if they're relying on other countries for most of their power?
It's a huge vulnerability. And you're right, it definitely highlights the importance of energy independence. But going back to your question about the energy mix itself, the biggest player right now is still petroleum products, coming in at a pretty whopping 37.7%.
So even with all the talk about renewables, petroleum products are still the dominant source. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, for now. Then you've got natural gas, which also plays a really significant role. Renewables are climbing steadily, followed by nuclear power, and then solid fuels, things like coal.
Yeah, okay. I imagine that given how diverse the EU is, that this mix probably varies quite a bit from country to country, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You've got countries like Cyprus and Malta that rely super heavily on petroleum, and then you've got others like Italy and the Netherlands who are more dependent on natural gas. Each country has kind of its own unique set of circumstances that influences their energy choices.
Okay, so that kind of paints a picture of where things stand today. But we keep hearing all this buzz about a renewable energy revolution that's happening in Europe. What's the reality there? Is it really living up to the hype?
Well, there's definitely some truth to that buzz. The Eurostat report points out that in 2023, renewable energy sources actually accounted for the largest share of energy that was produced within the EU, a significant 46%.
Wow, 46%. That is a really big deal. It sounds like this shift towards renewables is really gaining some serious momentum. What's driving this change?
It's a bunch of different factors, actually, but EU policies, things like the European Green Deal, are definitely playing a huge role. They're designed to promote renewable energy and reduce emissions, basically pushing the whole region towards a more sustainable future.
Right, that makes sense. It seems like climate change is on everyone's mind these days, and governments are starting to respond with some, well, concrete action, I guess. But beyond those policies, is there anything else fueling this renewable revolution?
Definitely. I mean, we've seen some absolutely incredible advancements in renewable energy technologies, which is making them cheaper and more efficient than ever before. So like solar panels, wind turbines, they're significantly more affordable now, and they produce way more power than they did even just a few years ago.
So it's kind of a win-win situation then. Less pollution, cheaper energy. It almost sounds too good to be true. Are there any downsides to this rapid shift towards renewables?
You bring up a really important point. I mean, while the benefits are pretty clear, the path to a 100% renewable future, it's not exactly a smooth ride. One of the biggest hurdles is actually integrating all these new energy sources into the existing power grid.
Why is that such a challenge?
Well, think about it. Unlike those traditional power plants that we're used to, sources like solar and wind power, they're intermittent, right? The sun isn't always shining, the wind isn't always blowing, and that creates a whole bunch of issues around reliability and stability.
Ah, I see. So it's not just about generating the renewable energy, it's about making sure that it's available exactly when and where it's needed.
Exactly. And to
Hmm.
do that, you need to invest in new infrastructure. You need to develop sophisticated energy storage solutions, and you basically need to completely rethink the way we manage our energy systems.
It sounds like a pretty monumental task. But before we get into those specific solutions, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture for a second. What does this shift towards renewables actually mean for, the average person living in Europe? How is it impacting their lives on a day-to-day basis?
That's a great question. And it really gets to the heart of why this whole energy transition is so important.
Because it's not just about these abstract concepts like gigawatts and megawatts. It's about how we actually live our lives, right?
Exactly. I mean, for a lot of people, the most immediate impact is going to be on their energy bills. As renewable energy becomes more and more common, and those costs continue to decline, we're likely to see more stable and potentially even lower energy prices over the long term.
Okay. Well, that would be a very welcome change for a lot of people, especially with the rising cost of living these days. But are there any downsides or potential concerns for consumers with this shift?
Well, one challenge is that this whole transition to renewables requires a lot of upfront investment in new infrastructure. And that can sometimes lead to some short-term increases in energy prices as those costs are passed on to consumers. But as the technology gets better and as we start to see economies of scale, those costs are expected to go down.
So it's maybe a little bit of a bumpy road in the short term, but the long-term benefits seem pretty promising. But are there any other ways besides the economic impact that this energy shift is affecting people's lives?
Well, it's also starting to influence job markets and career opportunities. As the renewable energy sector grows, it's creating all these new jobs in manufacturing, installation, maintenance, research, and development. So we're seeing a shift in the workforce with traditional energy jobs kind of declining, while those opportunities in the renewable sector are on the rise.
Hmm. That's a really interesting social and economic dynamic.
Yeah.
It sounds like this energy transition is way more than just swapping out power plants. It's reshaping entire industries and career paths.
Absolutely. And then beyond the economic implications, there's also this growing awareness of the environmental benefits of renewables, right? People are becoming way more conscious of their carbon footprint and they're looking for ways to live more sustainably. The fact that renewable energy options are more available now, well, it empowers them to actually make choices that align with their values.
It's like giving people more control over their energy consumption
Yeah.
and allowing them to make choices that benefit, themselves and the planet.
Exactly. And that brings us to the business side of things. The Haptic podcast that we mentioned earlier really focuses on how this energy transition is impacting the business world. And it's not just limited to companies that are directly involved in energy production.
You're saying that this is something that all businesses, no matter what industry they're in, need to be paying attention to.
Absolutely. The energy transition is creating both challenges and opportunities across the board. Businesses really need to adapt to this changing landscape if they want to thrive in the future.
Okay, so let's dive into those challenges and opportunities then. What are some of the key takeaways from that Haptic podcast? What advice are they giving to businesses that are trying to navigate this whole energy shift?
One of their main points is that businesses need to start thinking about energy as a strategic asset instead of just a cost of doing business.
What does that mean in practical terms?
It means things like looking for ways to reduce their energy consumption through efficiency measures, exploring the possibility of actually generating their own renewable energy on site, and even thinking about how to integrate energy storage solutions into their operations.
So it's like taking a much more proactive and holistic approach to energy management rather than just passively paying the bills each month.
Exactly. They basically argue that businesses that really embrace this shift can actually gain a competitive advantage. They can lower their operating costs, they can boost their sustainability credentials, which is becoming more and more important for consumers, and they can even open up these brand new revenue streams by becoming energy producers themselves.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Sounds like the companies that adapt quickly are going to be the ones that thrive in this new energy landscape.
Absolutely. Another key point they make is that businesses need to be flexible and they need to embrace innovation. The energy sector is changing so rapidly, and new technologies and solutions are emerging all the time.
So complacency is not an option, I guess.
Definitely not. The companies that are willing to experiment, invest in research and development, and partner with these innovative startups, they're the ones that are going to stay ahead of the curve.
Okay, this is all really fascinating, but I can already feel my brain starting to get a little overloaded with all this information. Before we jump into all the details about the specific technologies and strategies, can we take a second to recap what we've learned so far?
Sure. We've established that Europe is going through a major energy transformation, shifting away from fossil fuels towards renewable sources. This transition is being driven by a few things: policy initiatives, technological advancements, and a growing awareness that we need a more sustainable future.
And we've seen that this shift is affecting everyone, from individual consumers to businesses across every industry. It's definitely creating challenges, but it's also creating some really incredible opportunities for those who are willing to adapt and innovate.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating. I mean, we're literally witnessing a fundamental shift in how we power our world, and it's raising so many questions about the future of energy, the economy, and even geopolitics.
And that leads us perfectly into the next part of our deep dive. We've talked about the what, the shift towards renewables, but now it's time to get into the how. What are the actual technologies and strategies that are making this transition possible? Stay with us. Welcome back to our deep dive into Europe's energy mix. So we've talked about what the shift towards renewables, but now I kind of want to get into the how. What are the technologies and strategies that are actually making this transition possible?
That's a great question, because it's not just about like slapping up a few solar panels and calling it a day. It's a really massive systemic overhaul. And both of our sources, the Eurostat report and that Haptic podcast, they really dive into the specifics of this whole process.
Okay, so where do we even begin? What are some of the, I guess, key areas of innovation that are driving this change?
Well, energy storage is a good place to start.
Right.
Arguably the biggest hurdle when it comes to renewables. The Eurostat report actually highlights some pretty exciting developments in this area. I mean, we need a way to store all that sunshine for a rainy day, right?
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So what are some of the most promising solutions that they're looking at?
One of the big ones is battery storage. We're seeing some really incredible advances in battery technology, like both in terms of how much energy they can hold and how much they cost. Think like industrial-sized batteries,
Hmm.
capable of storing enough power to run whole neighborhoods or even cities for hours.
Wow, that's amazing. Are we talking like those Tesla power walls that we see popping up everywhere, just on a much larger scale?
Exactly. But batteries aren't the only option. Pumped hydro is another technology that's already being used quite a bit.
Pumped hydro. Can you remind me how that works again?
Sure. So basically, you have a system with two reservoirs at different elevations, and then you use excess electricity to pump water uphill to the higher reservoir. Essentially, you're storing energy in the form of gravity, right?
Right.
And then when energy demand spikes, you just let the water flow back down to the lower reservoir, which spins turbines and generates electricity.
So it's like a giant gravity-powered battery. Pretty clever way to harness natural forces for energy storage. Are there any other storage options that they're exploring?
Oh, yeah. Compressed air energy storage is another interesting one. You use excess electricity to basically compress air into these huge underground caverns. And then when you need energy, you release that compressed air, which spins turbines to generate power.
Wow, it seems like we're getting pretty good at finding creative ways to store energy. But storage is only one piece of the puzzle. What about the grid itself? How is it being adapted to handle all this renewable energy?
That's where smart grids come in. They're absolutely crucial for efficiently managing and distributing all that renewable energy. They're kind of like the nervous system of a modern energy system.
Yeah, I've heard the term smart grid before, but I'm not really sure what makes a grid smart. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. Think of it like this. Imagine a grid that's all wired up with sensors and digital technology. It can actually monitor and control the flow of electricity in real time. So it's way more dynamic and responsive than those old traditional grids, which is super important when you're dealing with intermittent sources like solar and wind.
So it's more like a two-way conversation between the energy producers and the consumers, instead of just blindly sending power one way.
Exactly. Smart grids can actually anticipate changes in both supply and demand, and they can adjust accordingly. They can even incentivize consumers to use energy during off-peak hours when renewable generation is really high. That helps to balance the grid and make sure we're using all that clean energy as efficiently as possible.
That is so cool. So smart grids seem like a big part of the solution.
Yeah.
What about these decentralized energy systems that Haptic mentioned? What role do they play in this whole transition?
Oh yeah, decentralized energy is another super interesting trend. It's basically about moving away from those giant centralized power plants that we're used to and shifting towards a more distributed model where energy is being generated closer to where it's actually being used.
Ah, so it's kind of like giving more power literally to the people.
Exactly. This could involve things like rooftop solar panels on homes and businesses, community-owned wind farms, or even microgrids, which can operate independently from the main grid.
Yeah, that makes sense. I imagine that would make the whole system much more resilient too, right? Like if one part of the grid goes down, the other areas can keep functioning.
Absolutely. Decentralized systems can really enhance resilience, and they reduce our reliance on, a single point of failure. Plus, they give individuals and communities more control over their energy production and consumption.
Yeah, it sounds like we're talking about a pretty fundamental shift in the way we think about energy. It's not just about those big power plants anymore. It's about empowering individuals and communities to be a part of this energy revolution.
You nailed it. And the shift towards decentralized energy is opening up a ton of new possibilities for businesses, too.
Okay, so let's talk business then. How are companies adapting to this changing energy landscape? What are some of the innovative things that they're doing?
Well, one of the most obvious opportunities is in renewable energy production itself. We're seeing a huge surge in companies that are specializing in solar, wind, all those renewable technologies. They're basically developing and installing these systems at an unprecedented pace.
That makes sense. But what about companies that aren't directly involved in energy production? How can they benefit from this shift?
Oh, there are tons of ways. For example, they can invest in energy efficiency measures to reduce their own energy consumption and save money. That could be simple things like upgrading their lighting or improving insulation in their buildings, or it could be more high-tech solutions like using smart energy management systems.
Right, that reminds me of that AI-driven energy management that Haptic was talking about. They seem pretty excited about that.
Yeah. Oh, they were. And for good reason. AI can actually analyze all this data about energy use and optimize things in real time. So it can predict demand, adjust consumption patterns, and identify areas for improvement, which can lead to huge cost savings and reduce emissions.
It sounds pretty futuristic.
Yeah,
Is that technology actually being used in the real world, though? Are there companies that are already doing this successfully?
absolutely. A lot of companies, especially in industries that use a lot of energy, they're already reaping the benefits of AI-driven energy management. For example, some manufacturing companies are using AI to optimize their production processes, so they're using less energy and creating less waste.
Wow, that's impressive. So
Yeah.
it's not just about switching to solar panels. It's about really rethinking how businesses approach energy management and using technology to make their operations as efficient as possible.
Exactly. And on top of that, businesses are now able to buy renewable energy directly from producers through these things called power purchase agreements or PPAs.
Okay, what is a PPA and how does that work for businesses?
It's basically a long-term contract between a business and a renewable energy producer. The business agrees to buy a certain amount of energy at a fixed price, which is often lower than what they'd pay to a traditional utility company. This gives them some price stability and allows them to, show that they're committed to sustainability.
So they're basically cutting out the middleman, those big utility companies, and getting their energy straight from the source.
Exactly. PPAs are becoming really popular as more businesses want to reduce their carbon footprint and get more control over their energy costs.
It sounds like it's a win-win for everyone involved.
Yeah.
Are there any other interesting business models that are popping up around renewables?
Definitely. We're seeing companies that are specializing in providing energy storage solutions for homes and businesses. Basically, they're acting like the bankers of renewable energy, storing it for when people need it.
And that's a great analogy. I can see how that would be super important for making sure renewable energy is reliable, especially since it can be intermittent, like we talked about earlier. Any other examples?
Yeah, there are also companies that are developing these platforms that connect renewable energy producers directly with consumers. So it creates these peer-to-peer energy trading markets.
Oh, wow. So instead of going through a big utility company, people and businesses can buy and sell energy from each other directly.
Exactly. They're using things like blockchain to make sure these energy markets are transparent and secure. It's allowing people to become both energy producers and consumers.
That's incredible. It's really shaking up the traditional energy model. It seems like this energy transition is leading to all sorts of innovation, creating new business models and opportunities that we couldn't have even imagined a few years ago.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we've only just scratched the surface here. There's so much potential as this transition continues.
Okay, I'm definitely feeling optimistic about the future of energy now.
Hmm.
But let's be realistic for a second. This transition isn't going to happen overnight, right? There must be some pretty big challenges that are standing in the way of a fully renewable powered Europe.
Yeah, you're right. There's been a lot of progress, but there are still some hurdles to overcome. One of the biggest ones is just the sheer scale of what we need to do. We need to build out this renewable energy infrastructure at an incredible pace if we're going to meet these ambitious climate goals. And that requires a huge amount of investment, both from governments and from private companies.
Yeah, money makes the world go round, but it doesn't always flow easily, especially when you're talking about these big infrastructure projects.
Exactly. And then there's also the whole regulatory and bureaucratic side of things, which can sometimes really slow down the process of getting these new energy projects up and running. You've got permits, land acquisition, grid connection approvals, and often you have to navigate all these different stakeholders and their interests.
Ah, yes, the dreaded red tape.
Yep, it's a reality. And then we can't forget about public acceptance either. Not everyone is thrilled about having these giant wind farms or solar installations in their backyard.
Right, the classic not in my backyard syndrome.
Exactly. So addressing those concerns, getting communities on board, and making sure that the benefits of renewable energy are being shared fairly, that's all really important for building public support.
It sounds like this transition is about a lot more than just technology. It's also about social change, community engagement, and finding ways to work through these complex political and economic issues.
That's a really important point. The energy transition isn't just a technological challenge, it's a social, economic, and political one too. It takes collaboration, compromise, and a shared vision for a sustainable future.
Okay, starting to see the bigger picture here. But before we get too deep into those big questions about geopolitics and policy, let's bring it back to our listeners. What can we as individuals do to prepare for this changing energy landscape? How can we be part of this energy revolution?
That's a great question. It's actually pretty empowering to realize that we all have a role to play in this transition.
So what are some practical things that people can do? What advice would you give to someone who wants to get involved and help make this shift towards a renewable energy future happen? Welcome back to the deep dive. We spent this episode talking about the what and the how of Europe's energy transition, but I think it's time now to zoom out a little bit and look at the, I guess, bigger picture. What are the geopolitical implications of this whole energy revolution that's going on?
That's a really important question. Because this shift towards renewables, it's not just about technology and economics. It's really reshaping these global power dynamics and in a pretty profound way.
Okay, so paint me a picture. How is Europe's energy transition playing out on the world stage?
Well, one of the most significant impacts is that it's reducing Europe's reliance on those fossil fuel imports, especially from, regions that maybe have a history of instability. You remember earlier we were talking about how the EU imports over half of its energy.
Yeah, that number really surprised me, and it definitely made me think about how vulnerable Europe might be.
Exactly. I mean, historically, that dependence on imports has made Europe really susceptible to things like price shocks and supply disruptions. But this whole transition to renewables is kind of changing the game. It's helping to reduce that vulnerability and really boost Europe's energy security.
So it's not just about going green, it's about, like, strategic autonomy, reducing their reliance on partners that might not be so reliable.
Precisely. By diversifying their energy mix and boosting domestic production, Europe's getting a lot more control over their energy future.
But this whole shift away from fossil fuels, it must be having a huge ripple effect in other parts of the world too, right? Especially for countries whose economies are really dependent on oil and gas exports.
Oh, absolutely. Those countries are definitely facing a new reality as the demand for their main exports starts to decline,
Mhm.
and that can lead to a lot of things: economic problems, social unrest, even political instability.
That's a that's kind of a sobering thought. Are there any specific regions or countries that are particularly vulnerable in this new energy landscape?
Russia's a really good example. They've historically been a huge supplier of oil and gas to Europe, and the EU's move towards renewables has already put a strain on their relationship.
Especially given all the recent geopolitical tension, this energy shift is just, I don't know, adding another layer of complexity to an already pretty delicate situation.
Absolutely. It's creating challenges and opportunities, I think, for international cooperation. So, on the one hand, it's disrupting all these existing energy relationships, and that could create friction between countries. But on the other hand, it's also forcing countries to find new ways to collaborate and partner on these clean energy solutions.
So it's not just about breaking those old dependencies. It's about creating these new alliances and finding, like, common ground, I guess, in this pursuit of a more sustainable future.
Exactly. And the EU, for example, they're actively seeking out partnerships with countries that have a lot of potential for renewable energy.
Makes sense. They're looking to replace those old fossil fuel dependencies with new, cleaner partnerships.
Mhm.
Where are they looking for these new energy allies?
North Africa is one key area. There's so much potential there for solar power generation. And the EU is really exploring ways to import that clean energy across the Mediterranean. It's kind of like a new energy Silk Road connecting Europe to this huge source of renewable power.
That's a really powerful image. But I imagine these new partnerships come with their own set of challenges, right? It can't be as simple as just, I don't know, flipping a switch and importing clean energy.
Of course not. You have to negotiate fair agreements. You have to make sure that the development of those renewable resources in those partner countries is sustainable. And you have to be really sensitive to the geopolitical dynamics at play. There's a lot to consider.
So it's not like a magic solution. It's a whole new set of dynamics to figure out. It requires diplomacy, collaboration, and a real commitment to shared goals.
Hmm.
But ultimately, isn't this whole energy transition a really positive development for the planet?
Oh, absolutely. This global shift towards renewables is essential if we're going to address climate change. And Europe is taking a real leadership role in this transition, setting an example for everyone else.
Yeah, they're definitely putting their money where their mouth is. And like we've been talking about throughout this deep dive, this transition is driving innovation, creating economic opportunities, and leading to a much more sustainable way of life. It's not just about saving the planet, it's about building a better future.
That's a perfect way to put it. We've only scratched the surface of this topic, but I hope this deep dive has given everyone a better understanding of what's happening with Europe's energy transition and how it's going to affect the world.
It's been a really fascinating journey for me, exploring everything from the technical stuff about how energy storage works to those big picture questions about how the shift is going to change global politics.
And remember, this whole transition is still unfolding. The choices we make today are going to have a huge impact on what the energy landscape looks like tomorrow. And it's really up to all of us, governments, businesses, and individuals, to work together to create a more sustainable and equitable energy future.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Europe's energy revolution. I hope you've learned some new things, maybe gained a fresh perspective, and that you feel inspired to be a part of this incredible journey.
And until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay energized.